Hey everybody, it's the Scholar Channel, 入蹕图卷. Today on the channel, I want to talk about Chinese polearms because it's kind of underrated on the internet in my opinion. There's not much discussion on it. And in this video, I want to do kind of a general overview of late imperial Chinese polearms. So late imperial basically just means Ming and Qing periods. So that's going to be roughly in the mid 14th century all the way to the early 20th century really, but mostly we're going to focus on that Ming and early Qing period. Now, one thing to know about polearms is that they inherently resist any kind of classification because they basically, you can just take any kind of metal shape and you put it on the end of a stick and it becomes a polearm. So there's like an overwhelming, mind-numbing variety in the amount of different types and subcategories and combinations of all types of polearms. I'm not going to get into those weeds too deeply in this video. I just want to make a general overview, and I think that one fairly straightforward and simple way to classify different polearms a little bit is what they can do. So in my view, there are kind of 6 categories of polearms, and the first one is to thrust. The second one is to cut things. The third one is to smash things. Fourth one is to kind of spike things. The fifth is to hook things, and the 6th, in my view, is to kind of catch things. And I'll get into the details of all those different categories later and why I think that they are distinct. I think that if we look at these categories and we think of polearms in this way, we can actually see kind of a big difference between European polearms and Chinese polearms, even though it does have to be said that polearms on different sides of the Eurasian continent are more similar than they are different. So let's start with the first category of polearm types, which is polearms that thrust. And what are the kind of ideal polearms that thrust? That is spears. Spears were a huge deal in China. We have a lot of manuals about spears. We have all kinds of interesting details about, different point movements with the spear and all this other stuff. But the main thing is that spears are everywhere. There's many different cross sections and shapes. I'm not going to go into like a bunch of detail about that right now because we got to keep moving on. Now, the second kind of polearms that we're going to talk about is cutting polearms. Cutting polearms are quite popular in China. The main 2 types that we have are glaives and axes. So glaive in this context, I'm referring to any type of single-edged blade or dao that's on a long stick, and they come in all different shapes and sizes. I also want to give a shout out to a polearm that kind of appears a little earlier in the Song period, but is another cutting polearm that's a little bit unique, which is the zhao dao, or the oar-shaped dao, and this is a dao that actually has 2 edges. So I know I said that dao have single edges, but I lied. There's a few rare exceptions where you can have a double-edged dao, and basically the zhao dao, you just take a wide, flat, diamond cross-section piece of metal and you put it on a stick, and then you can cut both ways with it. So in some ways it can function almost like a double-headed axe, but you just have one blade on the top instead of one on each side. And in addition to that, we also have, of course, the axes. Now the axes, they show up quite a bit in artwork, even though the antiques are a lot more rare, but they were definitely a presence during these periods. Now the third kind of polearm I'm going to talk about is crushing polearms, or polearms that use blunt impact as their primary means of damage. A lot of cutting weapons can also kind of do blunt impact. Like if I hit you with an axe, or anybody gets hit with an axe, obviously it's not just the blade, it can also be the weight of the axe smashing them, right? However, if we want to think about polearms that are more exclusively focusing on blunt impact, then a couple of the kind of classic ones would be like the lang ya bang, big wooden spiked club. Aside from this, we also have 2-handed maces, and basically you get a big long stick and then you put a heavy ball on the end and then you whack people with it. And it's pretty straightforward. It's about as simple as a weapon gets, really. So one other more niche blunt impact weapon that we don't know very much about but did exist is the iron staff. In Cheng Zongyou's manual on the quarterstaff, he also says if you're going to go to war, instead of taking a wooden stick, you can just take a metal rod and just beat people with a metal rod. It sounds like that would be extremely heavy, and I'm not sure how fast it would be, but it should be noted that his quarterstaff design is also quite tapered. So even if it was a pretty heavy rod, if it's tapered out to one end and you have more mass at your end that you're wielding, you could probably get some good whacks with it. And that would be a pretty powerful blunt impact weapon if you're thinking about like a 10-foot staff or something like that. Now the next 3 categories of polearm are ones that spike, hook, or catch. And these are all fairly similar in that they all involve a whole perpendicular protrusion off the shaft of a polearm. However, I would argue that there's some important distinctions in their use. Namely, a spiking polearm is one that's intended to strike with the protrusion on the polearm shaft. A hooking one is obviously designed to hook and pull something, and a catching one is designed to kind of catch and push something. And these are all fairly different uses, and we can see differences in design of polearm when they're being optimized for one or the other. Now, when we think about a spiking polearm, it's quite rare that a striking protrusion that is intended to spike somebody is going to be a completely perpendicular to the shaft and be very straight, because the arc of the strike itself will be slightly curved. So a lot of times we can see a slight curvature and some type of sharp point, and that could be very easily used to strike someone. In China, kind of the main polearms that fall into this category would be the sickles, or types of sickles. So liandao. Liandao is a sickle. It's the same kind of sickle that you would use in agriculture, but they can take those and they can stick them on big polearm shafts, and then you can use it as a spiking weapon. In addition to that, there's also a class of weapons called spades, or chaten, literally like a shovel spade. However, some of them, like the tianpengchan, are kind of a flared out semicircle with two spikes kind of on the end, and that could very easily be used for striking. Now I want to talk about a big difference between European and Chinese polearms. In Europe, they like to have very strong reinforced spikes on some of their polearms because they're trying to, punch through some heavy armor, and they'll have like a square cross-section or a triangular cross-section on this spike, whereas something like a sickle in China is going to be a much thinner blade that's a spike. However, we shouldn't think that these more reinforced points don't exist in China, but they were much less common. In Japan, they do have what's known as the war pick, or the tsuruhashi, and that is basically just what it sounds. It's a crane beak pick, where you strike them with the crane's beak, and it's supposed to be a crane beak cross section, which is why it's called a crane beak. And in China, we actually I've seen in two manuals, two military treatises, I've seen a couple references to a weapon like this. However, it's a little bit different. In the Jingguo Xiongyu, we have a reference to the yazui hao. Now, the character hao here is quite strange. It's probably intended to be gao, which is pickaxe, and it describes the weapon as, being shaped like a crow's beak. So just like in Europe, they sometimes call these reinforced spikes a crow's beak. In China, this name also exists. However, the big difference is that this is a weapon intended for naval warfare. It's extremely long, like 7 meters or like 20 feet in length, and you're basically trying to spike on the other boat. And we see another version of the same weapon later in the皇朝禮器图式, except this time it's called the 铁腕. And 铁 is iron, and 腕 is something used to kind of pull. So the idea, I think, here is that you spike down onto the ship. Either maybe a person's there too, that's bonus points, right? But you spike down on the ship and then you try to pull it in so you can engage in boarding actions. But what this means is that they weren't really using a super reinforced point in order to go through armor. And there's several reasons for that, and I can make a whole nother video on that. But in general, in Europe, they like to do reinforced points to do anti-armor. In China, they had some reinforced points, but they weren't using them for that. And fifth category is hooking polearms. So hooking polearms, obviously you hook something and you pull it in. And my favorite hooking polearm, and one that's in my mind severely underrated, not represented in enough Chinese martial arts, is the hook spear. So it's literally just a spear with a hook on it, so you can hook things and then stab them. And gouqiang. And this is a super useful weapon that saw quite a bit of use, but it's not very well represented. In addition to this, many sickles and spades could also be used for hooking. Now, the last category of polearms is catching polearms. So it's polearms that would have some kind of opening that's designed to catch any kind of opponent's weapon and then push it or keep it from coming in. A lot of people have said that tridents aren't very useful because if you try to poke something with them, you are reducing your force over 3 points and it's not very effective. However, the point of a trident is not really, in my view, to stab into things deeply. It's so that you can catch things with those extra protrusions. And they really seem to like this in China. So we have things like the 虎叉 or the tiger fork, In addition to that, we also have what's called the rakes, or the tangba. But there's one more weapon in China that takes this principle to the absolute utmost extreme, and that is the langxian, or the wolf brush. Basically, you have a big piece of bamboo that just has a ton of forks, and it's designed to catch any kind of oncoming spear. Honestly, if I was going against a spear one-on-one, then anyone who's, I feel like I could easily keep them from stabbing me if I just have a giant thing of forking branches in front of me. And that's kind of the idea. So people talk about the spear being the king of the battlefield, but that's only because they don't practice against a wolf brush. And this category of polearms, I feel like, is uniquely emphasized in China as opposed to other regions, because we do have things like the langxian. And in addition to this, we also have many manuals, and the manuals talk about, which angles are good for catching spears and other things like that. And I think a big part of this unique focus on these catching weapons in both the manuals and in the variety and all this other stuff is due to the extreme prominence of the spear, especially if we're thinking about, lightly armored troops in, like, whenever Qi Guang has to raise a peasant army. Basically, he's going to take a bunch of people without armor, and they have to think about how are they going to fight spears without armor. And I think the catching polearms are the solution to that problem. Alright, so let me know what you think down in the comments below. Do you think that China has a unique focus on these, like, catching polearms, and that Europe has a unique focus on these reinforced spikes? I look forward to reading all of your comments. You guys are always great. Thank you all for watching. Please subscribe and don't forget to stay sharp.